If a cat climbed into your backpack while you were deployed in a war zone, would you take it as a sign? That's what happened to Staff Sergeant Daniel Rains, somewhere near the Syrian border, in the middle of a bitterly cold morning. He was checking supplies, scanning the horizon like he had done every day for months, numb to everything but duty. But that morning, something soft and warm burrowed into his gear and didn't want to leave. Daniel was 38, quiet, methodical, a man shaped by 17 years of service and 2 divorces. He didn't talk much anymore, not even to his unit, except when orders required it. His nights were filled with silence and muscle pain, and letters from home he no longer opened. The only thing he trusted was routine and his own silence. Back home in Kansas, his mother had just gone into hospice. His sister had left him another voicemail, one of many, saying he needed to come home before it was too late. But Daniel didn't know how to go home. He'd buried too many friends, carried too many regrets, and feared he wouldn't recognize himself without the uniform. The day the cat appeared, Daniel had been sleeping in shifts, barely eating. Supply drops were late, and temperatures had dropped below freezing. As he knelt beside his pack, something hissed, not out of fear, but hunger. A pair of pale green eyes stared back at him from inside the folds of canvas. The cat was tiny, ribs showing through a patchy coat, one ear bent like it had been frostbitten. It didn't meow. It just stared at him, refusing to move, as if the backpack was safer than the world. And Daniel, who had seen men lose limbs and lives, found himself frozen by the gaze of a 4-pound animal. He looked around, unsure if this was a joke. No one else had seen it happen. No one was laughing. And for the first time in months, he felt something other than dread, confusion, and then, strangely, concern. The cat was trembling, but it didn't try to run. It was choosing him. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He watched the cat curl into the bottom of his tent, tucked inside a wool scarf he never used. It didn't cry, didn't scratch, just breathed slow and shallow. He told himself he'd take it to the medics in the morning, but something told him he wouldn't. The next day, his commanding officer noticed something odd. Daniel was smiling, just slightly, while warming a can of tuna over a portable stove. When asked about it, he simply said, "It followed me." And somehow, nobody questioned it. In a place filled with chaos, maybe a cat didn't need an explanation. But rules were rules. Pets were forbidden. The penalties for harboring animals in the barracks were strict. Daniel knew this. And still, when the unit moved camp 2 nights later, he zipped the cat into his backpack again, quietly, gently. It didn't protest. It knew it belonged. As they reached the new post, Daniel heard something that made him freeze. A distant, high-pitched yowl, not from the cat, but something else. A sound that would force him to make a choice, one that would ripple through every part of his life from that moment on. The sound echoed again, a whimper, faint but unmistakable, coming from a half-collapsed building across the field. Daniel's instincts kicked in, and he motioned for his team to stay back as he approached, rifle up, heart pounding. Inside, behind broken bricks and rusted metal, were 2 more kittens, barely alive. Their fur was matted with dirt and dried blood, eyes crusted shut from infection. One was dragging a leg that looked broken, the other too weak to lift its head. Daniel crouched slowly, his breath catching. He hadn't cried since Kabul, but something about their helplessness cracked something open. He looked over his shoulder. No enemies in sight, just silence and cold air. But time was ticking. If they didn't move soon, the whole unit would be exposed. He had less than 2 minutes to make a decision. Leave them or carry them, risking everything. The cat in his backpack started to stir, sensing the others. It made a soft chirp, like encouragement. Daniel, against every rule and ounce of military logic, pulled off his jacket and wrapped the kittens carefully inside. He would find a way. He had to. By nightfall, the temperature dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The kittens had stopped moving, and Daniel knew they wouldn't survive like this. He snuck into the field medic tent under the excuse of a shoulder cramp, asking quietly if there was any spare 4 fluid or glucose. Corporal Myers looked at him with suspicion, until Daniel unzipped his jacket just enough to reveal the tiny heads. Myers didn't say anything, just handed over a heating pad, antibiotics, and whispered, "You didn't get this from me." For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt something like hope. But word travels fast in the unit. Rumors started. Rains has gone soft. He's losing it. One soldier mocked him openly during chow. Daniel didn't respond. He was used to being misunderstood. What mattered now were 3 small lives tucked under his cot. One morning, the kittens were gone. Panic surged through him, but then he found them curled up inside one of his boots, purring. The cat who had claimed his backpack was now grooming the weakest one, like a mother. Daniel couldn't believe it. They had formed a family. Command called him in that evening. They'd heard rumors. "We need to talk about the animals," his captain said, arms folded. Daniel braced for punishment. But before he could answer, a younger private walked by, saw the cat poking from the pack and said, "That's the only damn good thing in this place." Later that night, Daniel sat alone, staring at the desert stars. He realized he'd crossed a line, not of regulation, but of detachment. He'd let something in, something soft, something dangerous. But he also knew with absolute clarity, he couldn't walk away anymore. 3 weeks later, the base was hit during the night. Mortar shaking the ground, sirens blaring, men shouting in the dark. Daniel grabbed his gear by instinct, heart hammering, but before he reached the door, he froze. The backpack, the kittens, the cat still asleep under his cot. Smoke filled the barracks. He had a choice. Follow the evacuation or stay behind to carry 3 helpless lives through chaos. Without hesitating, he dropped to the floor, tucked the kittens into the pack, zipped it slowly, and stuffed the older cat into his jacket. Then he ran into the firestorm. Outside, the air was thick with dust and fear. Explosions lit up the desert sky like thunderclouds cracking open. Daniel ducked behind sandbags, shielding the backpack with his own body. A medic shouted at him to run for the bunker, but he kept crawling toward the shelter with the pack on his back. Inside the bunker, another soldier stared at him, wide-eyed. "You brought what with you?" Daniel didn't answer. He just knelt down, unzipped the bag, and checked their breathing. One of the kittens had wet itself, trembling. But they were alive. Somehow. All of them. After that night, something shifted in how the others looked at him. They stopped mocking. They started helping. One brought old socks to use as bedding. Another smuggled powdered milk from the mess hall. It was like everyone needed to care for something. They just didn't know it until now. When the unit's chaplain heard the story, he visited Daniel quietly one morning. "Sometimes God sends us small things," he said, placing a worn St. Francis medal in Daniel's hand. "Not to test our strength, but to remind us we still have hearts." Daniel didn't speak, but he kept the medal. Back home, his sister received a video. It was grainy, recorded on a soldier's phone. Daniel sitting in the sun, letting one kitten sleep on his lap while the older cat curled on his shoulder. She cried watching it. For the first time in years, her brother looked like someone still alive. When Daniel finally got leave, he didn't go straight home. He went to the veterinary checkpoint in Germany, where military animals get cleared. He spent his own money on vaccines, microchips, and cargo crates. He didn't care what it cost. "They're coming with me," he said flatly. The officer tried to argue. "You'll have to file a request through your CO and wait for civilian processing. Could take months." Daniel looked her dead in the eyes and said, "I waited years to feel again. I'm not leaving them." 2 hours later, the paperwork was rushed through. The moment the plane lifted off, Daniel rested his hand over the crate beside him. A soft meow answered back. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, not just from fatigue, but from release. For the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he was finally going home. 6 months later, Daniel lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Wichita. Nothing fancy, just space, sunlight, and quiet. The backyard had a little garden now, mostly tomatoes and herbs, and a patch of earth where the kittens liked to roll. He named them Honor and Chance. The cat that started it all? Grace. Each morning began the same. Black coffee, porch swing, Grace curled in his lap, purring like an old motor. The kittens chased butterflies across the lawn while the sun climbed over the fence. For a man once shattered by war and silence, the stillness now felt like a gift, not a burden. Daniel had started volunteering at the VA hospital, not as a counselor. He wasn't ready for that, but just to sit with other vets who didn't talk much. He brought the cats sometimes. Even the gruffest Marines softened when Honor crawled into their laps, or Grace bumped her head against their knees. People started to ask questions. Why cats? Why now? Daniel didn't give long answers. He usually just shrugged and said, "They found me." But if someone looked him in the eyes and waited, he'd sometimes add, I think they came to remind me I was still human. One afternoon, a teenager showed up at the VA. His dad had just come back from a tour and wasn't speaking. The boy sat in the corner, arms crossed, until Chance climbed into his hoodie, curled up, and didn't move. 10 minutes later, the boy was crying. So was his father. Daniel watched it happen, heart heavy and full. These weren't just pets. They were bridges. Between silence and speech, between trauma and peace, between who he was and who he might still become. He wasn't healed, but he wasn't hollow anymore. He began sharing his story at schools and local shelters, not as a hero, but as someone who had learned to listen to small voices, soft pause, things easy to ignore. Sometimes what saves you, he told a crowd once, isn't loud, it's just persistent and patient. Word spread. Donations to local animal rescues tripled. Soldiers from other states reached out, asking how to adopt. One shelter even launched a program in his name. Backpacks for strays, pairing veterans with rescued animals. Daniel didn't want credit, but he kept every thank you letter. Years later, his porch had new scratches on the railings, new collars hanging by the door. Grace had grown old, but still slept by his side. The house had laughter now, from visitors, from nieces, from people who came just to meet the soldier and his cats. It didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like home. He didn't just save a cat in the middle of a war zone. He didn't just carry them out of danger. He carried himself back too, piece by piece. And every purr, every paw print on his floor was proof of one quiet truth. He hadn't been rescued from the war. He'd been rescued from forgetting how to love.